Good morning. I'm excited for you all to be here, and one of the things that is most exciting is just to share with you some information. The field of neurofeedback, neuropsychology, to me is infinite. Tell people if you decide to practice or add this to your practice, you're going to be learning for years to come. Having graduated graduate school in the early 90s, I had not ever heard about neurofeedback as an option. At the time, there were 4 clinics in Atlanta area. One of the founders of the system I use, Pete Van Dusen, he was providing neurofeedback right there in Atlanta, and I had never heard of it. I think I've heard of it briefly in the early 2000s, and then not till recently had I seen more information about it. So hopefully today what I'd like you to get is just a feel for what neurofeedback is, how you might add it to your practice, and some of the research that's been done and research that needs to continue to be done as we move forward. So what is neurofeedback? This is a description from John Nemos, and it's changing the metabolic information in the brain. So things like I'm feeling calmer, I'm feeling more patient, my memory's improving, I'm sleeping better. These kinds of things I hear from clients can be a direct effect of some of the brain training that they've done using neurofeedback. This initially had some writing on it, doesn't here, but it talks about the brain, and our brain has enough electrical activity to power a light bulb. Oh, there we go. 30-watt light bulb. So every neuron is connected to other neurons. We have an estimated million billion connections in our brain. And as we talk a little bit today, I'll talk a little bit about the electrical activity. In our brains, we have electrical and chemical activity. And we've heard a lot, you're probably familiar with the medications, which often affect the neurotransmitters. But if you go to ISNR, International Society for Neurofeedback, and you hear some of the presenters, they'll talk about things called action potentials. And so they're talking about the electrical activity that they're tracking, probably much more than neurotransmitters that you'll hear people talk about when they talk about SSRIs and other medications. So there's just a kind of review of what a neuron might look like. And what they're finding is that it's not only certain parts of the brain, but there's systems in the brain. From the research they've done, there seems to be networks. And there's about 5 or 6 common networks that they've discovered and identified. And these could be areas from the back of our brain that connect through the front of our brain and the sides of our brain. So they're finding out more and more as they go on. Just another picture of the neuron electrical activity. So this is an image of somebody with electrodes on their head. And the first person to detect brain activity was Hans Berger, and that was in the early 1900s. But this is still applicable today. So this person has some electrodes on his head at different sites, and they can record, or we can record brain wave activity at those particular sites. So in the early days, this is kind of how they did what's called a brain map. They might do 2 electrodes, 4 electrodes, and they basically were taking pictures of the brain waves and mapping it out. We've progressed to the point where now we use caps, and at some point I'll pass around the caps for you to look at and get an idea of what they look like. So this works the similar way to like a stethoscope might listen to your heartbeat. The difference is that there's an amplifier involved because our brain waves are very small, and we're picking them up on the scalp through that hard surface. Pretty large amplifier has to be used to pick up those brain waves, but it can be done. This is pictures, kind of tiny. It's difficult to see, but it outlines some of the different frequencies that we pick up when we're looking at a brain wave. So at the top, you can see the different images. There's one at the top that looks kind of like a mountain. It's large and rolling. That's slow wave activity, so that's associated with delta and theta waves. The smaller, quicker waves, beta waves. And I believe there's a slide that describes this in a minute. So that's just one example of an amplifier. There's probably a dozen or hundreds of different ones on the market. Mine's actually red, and the plugs are at the top versus this one on the side. Let me go back a minute. So if you are a neurofeedback practitioner, there's lots of equipment and things that you have. It shows a little bit on there in the bottom, and I'll pass that out at some point, but there's physical tools to the trade that you get familiar with and that you utilize in the work that you do. So here's an example of the program that I use. On the bottom, you can see the green wave and the red wave, and that's electrical activity on somebody's brain in those 2 sites. On the right-hand side, you can see the different colors, and those are the bandwidths for the different brain waves. And at the top, you can see a graph, and at the bottom you can see a graph, and that's kind of charting the feedback that's going on with the client. They don't see this screen, but as the clinician, you see this screen, and so you can get an idea of what's going on. Are they able to inhibit the brain wave that you're wanting it to inhibit? Is it increasing or producing or rewarding more of the brain wave that you picked out as part of the program? And so you can track that, and after each session you can kind of go back and see, was this successful? Was the person able to make changes in their brain waves? Typically 80% of people are able to do this. It's brain training. There are a small percentage of people that do not have success with it. They're not quite sure why. They haven't identified who will be able to or who won't be. My hypothesis is that there's something else going on at the neuronal level, something that we're just not aware of. So in a healthy brain, and we talk more and more, if you're in a neurofeedback conference, they talk about more and more what is a healthy brain. And so traditionally, a a lot of the neurofeedback goes off of norms. It's typical to like IQ, where you have average of 100, and then you have standard deviations going up or down. They'll say, well, 100 is normal or 100 is average. So many of the neurofeedback systems base the information on norms for a particular age group and a particular brain activity. One of the systems I use actually doesn't use that model. It uses more of ratios based on the person's particular brain. So even within the neurofeedback, there's different ways of looking at how do you want to train somebody's brain. And interestingly enough, the more they practice and the more they research, not everybody's always convinced there's such thing as a normal brain, or that we should be training people's brains in a particular way. Because if you're an engineer, some of those qualities that make you a successful engineer is the result of brainwaves, or a creative artist. And so they'll talk about how much training to do. But in general, brain training creates flexibility. And so people that participate in brain training are often able to switch which states they're in. And this allows people to self-regulate. So again, good balance of brain waves, that's kind of subjective, but overall the research and what people in certain specialities decide what is good. This is a picture of my son using HEG, neurofeedback. I think he's 7 at the time. And HEG is a form of biofeedback. They talk about it under neurotherapy, but it's actually using a light sensor, and it's detecting the blood flow in his prefrontal cortex. And that you wonder, how does it do that? Well, our skulls actually have porous capacity, so the engineers figured out a way to detect the blood flow. And so based on how our brain is using blood flow, we can either activate our brain in the prefrontal cortex, or we can reduce it or kind of dysregulate, or what you call more relax, kind of go offline. So this is a very simple form of feedback that's been successful in a lot of different conditions, ADHD in particular, Asperger's spectrum disorder, and individuals just in general can benefit, because if you have better prefrontal cortex control, you're getting better emotional regulation, you're getting typically better decision making, less impulsivity, so it's very helpful.
Clearly, what you're presenting impacts regulation, dysregulation, but can neurofeedback also impact personality?
I have not experienced that. I have not seen it written in the literature. And one of my case studies, we'll talk a little bit about that. Part of my training is I did neurofeedback myself. So, my husband might say, yeah, you're a lot less anxious. I might, now that when I get on a plane, I don't have any of the thoughts or symptoms that I had, prior. When I was getting on a plane, we were getting ready for takeoff. But did my personality change? Probably not a whole lot, or I would probably hear about it, but yeah.
Now, on the wig, do you put it on the wig too?
The wig?
Yeah.
That was part of my initial training when you're learning the 20 brain sites. So that you see is kind of a mannequin head that they use to help us you know, make it real. But yeah, that's just initially starting off training.
Very interesting. This is fascinating. But I'm thinking if we could help you with your anxiety, you know, about the plane, well, wouldn't that slightly change your personality from anxious to more relaxed? So I mean, that's good.
You mentioned in a previous slide that some people are treatment resistant, and I'm just wondering, the bulk of my clinical research has been in transcranial magnetic stimulation and using it in populations that are treatment resistant either to psychotherapy or pharmacological interventions. And so I'm curious, because it is able to change neuronal firing and cerebral blood flow, do you think, or are you aware of literature that suggests that TMS can prime the brain to benefit from neurofeedback when it wouldn't otherwise be able to do so?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I will say that one client that I worked with that had TMS and she didn't find it successful, we only had limited results with her using neurofeedback. So she got a little bit of benefit, but it wasn't, you know, what we would hope for. So it may be just, you know, I don't know. I don't, you know, enough personal experience with working with clients that have had TMS and neurofeedback. But I do know that the TMS Center in Richmond and Charlottesville often will refer people for neurofeedback. So
After treatment?
yeah,
Oh, that's
either
interesting.
yeah.
Could you say something a little more about the relation between the blood flow and the training?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you can see a little bit on the screen. You see on the left there's land, and as you move on the screen you'll see there's water. There's a red arrow pointing down. He is on the dive portion, and then the feedback in this situation is called a life game, where clients are asked to make the little person climb up the hill or dive, depending on which instruction they're given. And so if the person is on climb, they're instructed to try to look for the feedback, see if you can have the little guy move up the mountain. And in that case, if it does, it's more blood flows coming through the prefrontal cortex. And with this, it's 3 sites. So there's typically, well, actually there's more you can do, but typically F7, FPZ, and F8. Typically, that's what I'll train people with who are using this. And on the dive, it's kind of disengaging. Typically, people with attentional problems have a hard time climbing. People with anxiety have a more challenging time diving, so, in general. It can be very frustrating for people because they want to know, what am I supposed to be doing? And oftentimes what they're doing is just looking at the feedback, just noticing. So if we're watching a nature video, we want the nature video to be moving and playing as you would look at a television show. And if the brain is not producing the way we want it to produce, it can slow down, or it could be a little bit choppy. It could actually stop. And so the brain is getting the feedback, and with our mind, we're so used to, you know, what am I supposed to be doing? It can be very challenging. So oftentimes the instruction is don't think, don't try, don't judge your performance, just listen for the feedback. And as some of us know, that's difficult to do.
But on the previous slide, are you just thinking that you're not actually moving anything with your hands? You're just thinking, go down the mountain, go through the water. Is that what you're saying?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
So what we've found with a dysfunctional brain or unregulated brain is that we might have too much of a frequency in one site. So for example, the temporal lobes, which are here, typically, or a lot of times, people who are agitated, stressed, overwhelmed will have a high degree of high frequency wave in these areas. Temporal, parietal, this section of the brain, often fast activity in people that have early trauma, developmental trauma. The temporal and parietal. Yeah. So I may have a client who's got slow wave activity in a particular part of their brain that needs to be decreased, and then, for example, in the prefrontal cortex, there's too much slow wave activity, so we want to try to increase it so that it help with their attention. But there could be another site that they actually need to increase the low wave activity. So it's what I actually do is called whole brain training. But as we'll talk about, some of the researchers will just focus on one area of the brain, and they'll train that same protocol in the same area for 30 sessions to get a desired effect.
Is this used as a diagnostic tool for, say, ADHD or severe anxiety?
It can be. More and more people are utilizing that as a diagnostic tool. It's very tempting to utilize it, and I try to present it to clients more in the sense that this is kind of what the brain map is showing me. It's consistent with what you're reporting, or is consistent with ADHD, or is consistent with anxiety. And as we'll see, I think in another slide, for depression, it tends to be the left frontal lobe area, and that's the area that, for example, TMS will target. But not everybody has the same brain, and so there are variations. And that's why it's ideal to get a brain map when you're working with people.
Typically, does the insurance cover the whole brain training?
Right now, insurance typically isn't covering it. There's California and Florida, my understanding, that covers it. Now, there are some exceptions. If you get a QEEG done by an MD doctor, they'll pay for that. But so if you have an MD that's doing them, or a clinic that you're working with, that's a possibility. Yeah. That's one of the frustrations probably practitioners have had, and it may be changing. I got to see Seaburn Fisher speak about the research they're doing in Boston, and Bessel van der Kolk, and she said there's some class action lawsuits against insurance companies because they won't pay for it, and now it's evidence-based. They're having evidence that proves that it's effective. So the exciting thing is a person is learning how to regulate their brain waves. So what that means is that changes tend to be long-lasting. Many people reduce medications that they're taking. Some people eliminate medications that they're changing. And that's an exciting thing. So you think, how can I regulate my brain? Well, it's similar to the yogi meditators, the master meditators. They've learned how to regulate their brains, create more alpha. Obviously, they probably didn't do that through neurofeedback, but it's a possibility. It brings the possibility to more people to make changes. So one of the important people or founders when you're talking about neurofeedback is Barry Sternman. And he was actually more of a researcher. He didn't have much at all to do with psychology. He was asked to do some research, or was working for NASA, and found that they were working with a chemical I think it was the jet fuel, and the people that were exposed to it had some seizures and some bad effects. So he was doing research in that area and was working with cats and found that the cats that had been trained to produce SMR were much more seizure resistant. And so that got him curious into looking more into it. So the first study was actually done with cats. I don't think so.
My cat doesn't cooperate that well.
Well, and that's some of the arguments. They want more double-blind studies, clinical trials done. But when you're, working with cats, there's probably less of a placebo effect, or they're not, as motivated to please their trainer. So the SMR frequency, 12 to 15, found that the cats that had trained in that frequency were more seizure resistant. And interestingly enough, this is the same frequency that they'll often train with clients that have ADHD. So they'll usually train to create more of this SMR, which is considered a low beta wave. And it can help people pay attention and learn things. And it can also paradoxically plays a part in sleep, in our restorative sleep and our sleep spindles. This was some of the training with the cats. Once they the reinforcement was changed, they were able to produce the desired frequency.
Group of
So this was kind of proof that brain activity can be changed or altered through operant conditioning. And this was in '67. Then the first person that neurofeedback was tried with was 1971, a woman that had seizure disorders. And that obviously affected her life. And back then, he used a box with a red and green light. That was the feedback. If your brain was producing the brain wave that he wanted you to, you get the green light. If not, you'd see the red light. So twice a week for 3 months, she was nearly seizure-free. I think it was about 60 or 70% reduction in her seizures. So we have Joel Lubar, who enters the field. I believe he studied some under Sturman. And his love was ADHD, researching and working with that. And we'll come back to him in a minute. Joe Amaya found that people can control their brain waves. He was wondering if someone says, I feel relaxed, well, does that correlate with a brain wave that we're seeing on the computer? If someone says, I feel agitated, does that correlate, with a different state? And so he picked the alpha wave, which is a kind of the open, relaxed state. And he actually got lucky in the sense that the person that he first tried it with was very good at regulating their alpha. And of course, people differ in their ability to, change their brain waves. And because this person had such improvement, he went on to research it more and work with other people. If he had gotten somebody that wasn't able to regulate their alpha, he may have given up or thought, you know, there's nothing to this. So before I move on, just to review, when we're talking about brain waves, there's typically 5 categories that they talk about. So the slowest is delta. The next one is delta's often involved when we're sleeping, although you know our brains can have some of it when we're awake as well. Theta, which is a slow activity, typically it's associated with creativity, daydreaming. So that's beneficial, but if you have too much of it, it can be hard to pay attention. And then we have, after alpha, we have beta, or SMR, which they had talked about initially. So that's typically 12 to 15 hertz. And then we move into what's called high beta, which is more 19 to 28. And up in that range, typically it's very kind of hypervigilant, sometimes panicky. Typically that wave is not very helpful or effective to most people. And there's a new, there's a gamma wave, which is a fast wave that's associated with binding and integrating information. They say that Einstein's brain had a lot of gamma frequency in it. And they're finding more. There's another proposal, a bandwidth even higher. Some training that people do with neurofeedback now is below the 2 hertz, so still a lot more to figure out. So we're going to talk a little bit about stress, cortisol, and how this impacts our brain. Neglect, isolation, being ostracized, sustained exposure to cortisol can cause serious damage in the hippocampus. And so oftentimes when we're training the temporal lobes, that is the area of the brain that is associated with amygdala, which is also associated with the hippocampus. So the hypothesis was that if we're training in that area, we're going to make changes in that particular brain structure. And what they found is that most likely is true through fMRI and imaging, that the cortical placements will work its way down and have impacts on some of the people's brain structures.
You're saying that sustained exposure to cortisol can cause serious damage to the hippocampus. Is it reversible?
Yes, it is, yeah. And so you'll see this in, some of this is from the rat studies or mice studies when they exposed the rats and then, you know, dissected their brains. But people's personal experiences with early trauma or other, you know, stressful events in their life have, I think, shown some of this as well, shrinkage of the hippocampus. And hippocampus is involved in memory, and so what often happens is people's fight or flight system gets started, and so everything starts to be seen as a threat. And the hippocampus is responsible for kind of newer memories, is not able to restore new experiences. And so the person can kind of be stuck in the fight or flight mode. So in the rat studies, some of the things they did is they electrocuted their cages, they flooded their cages, they changed things around. Poor things made it difficult. And often what happened as a result was same things we might see in humans: inability to feel joy, poor sleep patterns, poor pain thresholds, learning abilities, reduced working memory. So with the idea that depression doesn't have just one cause, but it can arise from a series of events kind of coming together. This is a diagram of a brain map. It shows somebody's brain on the left, which is be more typical or healthy. The green is around that 0 or average. And then you have the standard deviations going to the left or to the right. And so on the right brain, you can see in the left prefrontal area, that brain has a area that's 3 standard deviations from the norm and probably responsible for causing some of the depressive symptoms that they're having. So you can see, this might be a good time, you can see the dots on the image, and those are corresponding to sites in the brain. And so typically somebody will have a 19-channel brain map. The one I use, it actually breaks it into segments. So we'll do a recording with 4 sites, then we'll do a recording with the next 4 sites, and so on for a series of 5 recordings. But you know, oftentimes practitioners will have the 19 channels and they'll get all the sites at the same time for a recording. So these are some examples of brain caps. These are kind of traditional ones that are used. And they're different colors, they're different sizes based on the person's head. So most people fall into the red cap area, but if you're working with children, the yellow cap, or they actually have infant caps that they have. The blue cap is for someone with a larger skull. And so as a practitioner, you become very familiar with this tool because you can be doing a lot of measuring. You're measuring the circumference, diameters, and the preauricular notches. And you're doing this because everybody's head is a different size, and you want to make sure you have your sites on the right places. And the sites correspond with what's called the Brodmann areas. And the Brodmann areas are a map of what brain structures or what area of the brain are we measuring. That was, I think it was 1929, Brodmann in Germany started to develop these areas. And how he did that is by taking slices of a brain, seeing, what was the neurological makeup of each section. And since then, it's been researched and adjusted, but overall, he was pretty accurate in his description of the brain areas and what those areas do. So we have these caps, we do measurements, we cap a person, and then the colorful rainbow gets plugged into the amplifier, and you get something similar to the screen that you saw before. Now this is traditional. New technologies have changed things. So I was looking at some brain caps in September. State-of-the-edge technology where you don't have to utilize gel. I'm not sure, they're fairly expensive, but as we go on, there's going to be more and more offered in the terms of technologies that you can use. So once the brain cap is on, and actually before we plug it in, we'll gel, what's called gel it. And if you want to look at this as an example of electrogel, it's kind of gooey. It's similar to hair gel, the consistency. And we use this scary looking thing, but it's not. It's a blunted to put gel in each of the electrocytes that you're seeing in the cap. Now, a lot of people will use caps for training because the advantage of that is that you could move through protocols quicker and easier. I tend not to use it just because it's a little bit messier for clients, and in a few minutes or later I'll show you some examples of electrodes and how they can be used for training. And so the original image of the man you saw with the electrodes, typically I'll use those for training because it's not as messy. So this talks about how, although typically in depression it could be the left frontal part of the brain, it's not always, it's not everyone. And so brain mapping is ideal. Working with the cap, getting a brain map is ideal. When I did my training a few years ago, people, and I'll still work with people that say, well, just, work off the symptoms, slap some electrodes on the areas that, you think are affected and start the training. So it has not been unusual for early neurofeedback people just to go off symptoms and just train the particular areas and the particular frequencies. But as technology increases and the capability to do brain maps are there, it can be really helpful. So most people I work with get a brain map. There are a few people that may not. If they're, anxious or stressed, I might just work with them on some temporal protocols. But if they're doing a full course of neurofeedback or have been suffering for a while, it's a good idea to get an idea of what might be going on. This is just from one of the studies they had published in 2014. The 24 participants, they had a control and a neurofeedback group. So one group got neurofeedback, one group didn't. I think both of the groups participated in traditional psychotherapy. And at the end, the individuals in the neurofeedback group showed improvement over 7 points. So it was actually, they went from 11 to 4, where the psychotherapy group only changed, I think maybe a point or less than a point. One of the challenges of neurofeedback research is, or one of the issues is the studies. They want them to be larger. So as you'll see, some of the studies that we have are under 100, and that's one of the challenges that they're working on. I think one of the most recent studies, they started out with 100, but then through people dropping out or other factors, there's about 76 participants.
Will this be done in conjunction with psychotherapy, traditional? What about medication?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Typically, clients that come in are already taking medication. They may or may not be working with a psychotherapist. So preferably, the preference would be to have psychotherapy, that this would not be used as a standalone intervention, but other interventions as well. There are places or companies that are promoting, this kind of intervention. For example, I had somebody call me and say, we can have neurofeedback set up in your office. We can see like 12 people a day, 30 minutes each, get them in, get them out. So there are, those kind of more intensive assembly line treatments. That's not my desire, but, it's certainly, they're becoming more available. So here is a picture of a brain, or two different brains, one depressed, one not depressed. And you see on the right that the not depressed brain has a lot more activity going on. In 2012, the Academy of Pediatrics reported about the evidence base of neurofeedback with ADHD, and they placed it as level 1 intervention. So this was very exciting for us at practice to say this should be the first line of treatment even before a stimulant medication or ADHD medication. There's a picture of a child doing training, has electrodes on his head. There are more pediatricians adding this to their practice. There's a few in Richmond that have started to add it as an option. So Joel Lubar is the one who is done the most research. This is kind of his area. More than 25 studies, all related to ADHD and ADD issues. He actually did a study which is a little bit disturbing. He trained people so that they were able to reduce their symptoms, improve their focus, improve their attention, reduce their hyperactivity, and then he actually retrained their brain back. So he trained them to improvement and trained them back kind of to, I guess, show that you can change a person's brain for better or for worse. Yeah, there's one or two studies that tracked individuals post a year and a half for the ADHD, and their symptoms had stayed consistently decreased. And so I think that's why the Pediatric Association got on board, because it was, the changes held up.
I have a concern, and you probably would know more than I do. It seems to me the new trend is, not as much psychotherapy because that's expensive. It just seems to be medication, and now I can see this new tool. What do you think of that as they're phasing out actual talk therapy and family therapy for even ADHD? Do you think this is going to become the new trend because it's probably cheaper?
It's not necessarily cheaper. Insurance companies don't pay for it right now, but I charge $75 a session. Some people charge $90 a session. Up in Northern Virginia, it might be $120 a session. But overall, the cost of, I think, stimulant medication for some people is a couple thousand, or the insurance companies are paying a couple thousand a year. So, but definitely, counseling, behavior modification, parents understanding what they can do to be helpful, that's critical. I don't think that anything could replace that. Yeah. And in fact, I believe it was Lubar or another person that specializes in this field requires the family to be involved in some kind of psychotherapy or behavioral. Yeah. And it is, it's exciting, and at the same time, it's not, it's not necessarily a standalone treatment. Many of the people I work with will do a combination of talk therapy and neurotherapy, or if they're doing neurotherapy with me, they'll have a counselor that I'll be talking to, or if it's somebody within our office, I'll be talking with them. Because it's, stress and working out and setting appropriate limits, all those things are really important. One of the studies that they did, or Vanderkopf did in Massachusetts, was kids or families that lived in housing projects. And they actually found that the stressful environments limited the benefits of neurofeedback. So you're going back into a stressful environment. If you're not addressing the system or the chaos, then certainly it could limit the effects that you have.
How do you attend to the epigenetics of transmission of trauma using this modality?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
Okay, maybe I'll say it differently. There's some studies done by a woman named Rachel Yehuda at the University of Chicago, where she found that interviewing children of Holocaust survivors and children of 9/11, that there is actually an epigenetic transmission of trauma that was psychologically based, where there was actual brain changes based on the epigenetics that was not understood in different. So I'm just wondering if that's something that this modality works with.
Yeah, I would imagine, since Sieber and Fisher is utilizing this, and you see it a lot in developmental trauma or trauma that's, passed down through the generations, I would think it's, still effective for the person that's receiving it. Yeah. This is probably a good time to take a break. I think we're going to take about 5, 10 minutes. So I just wanted to switch gears for a minute, or in terms of talking about diagnoses and challenges. Somebody asked about personality disorders in addition to other diagnoses. And what I've found is that this is similar to other clinical work. You have some cases that are straightforward. They come in, they come out, they show up, they do their sessions, they have great results. And then you have everybody else who, is not that clean a picture. And so, for example, one of my clients who's undergoing treatment right now, he is diagnosed bipolar disorder in his early 50s. He does have personality disorder issues, so the narcissism, and maybe antisocial, I'm not sure, but so those kind of things can compound the treatment process as well. He was a client who he was able to work at one time, was sometimes successful, but had a lot of interpersonal difficulties. He might blow up at his boss or walk off the job, these kind of things. And actually a history of going after his psychiatrist. Physically, he was in, I think it was Central State Hospital for a while. So a really difficult road that he had gone through the past few years. And he came to us and we started working, our nurse practitioner started working with him with his medications. And I said, why don't we try neurofeedback, because there's a lot going on. He had additionally had encephalitis at age 7, and so he had some probably brain, I'll say, damage or trauma. And, brought his brother and his mother in, and then they would talk about his volatility with them. The risk of him getting physical with them. He's done 20 sessions of neurofeedback. We went back and I did another brain map with him. saw a big difference in his prefrontal cortex, his ability to regulate, and he's reporting, I'm a lot more patient. I may get upset, but I don't react. Sometimes it's kind of like having a lid. It's an interesting experience because it's almost like someone's putting a lid over the symptom. You still may feel distressed or angry, but it's almost like something is stopping it from escalating more. But one of his favorite things was he wants to change his medication. So if I feel this way one day and that day another day, he would go to the nurse practitioner and want to change it. And oftentimes she would change it for him. So we just had that discussion of we need to keep everything, as long as you're stable and you're feeling, okay in terms of, not acting out, assaulting somebody, hurting yourself, hurting others, let's keep your medicine stable for the next 2 months. And so the practice is it's not necessarily any quicker, or easier, or simpler. Just because you're using this tool, you run into the same things of having to collaborate with the prescriber. Every client has medications they give me, and I'm responsible for telling them not only telling them, but writing down what are the overdose effects. So if they're on 3 medications or 9 medications that are psychotropic, I go and I get the effects that they could experience from having too much of that medication. Because as the brain makes changes, it may need less of a particular medication. And so it's possible for clients to have an adverse reaction to the medications they're taking, because it's almost like they're being overdosed now that their brain has changed. So, that with the same traditional assignments they're giving, or are they sticking with their psychotherapy? Because oftentimes when we train, the ideal amount of time is twice a week. And so they're taking 2 hours out of their week plus a travel time to participate in neurofeedback. So those are kind of some of the challenges that we face. And some of them, in terms of personality disorders, or I've seen probably more, but it could happen with anyone, is, am I making any progress? I don't think anything's changed. So starting out with a set of symptoms, I utilize like a 4 or 5 page symptom checklist that they have to fill out and get back to me. And then taking a step further, can they tell me in their own words what they're experiencing? So if it's a child, if the parent says he's having tantrums 3 out of 7 days and they're lasting for 45 minutes and he's screaming or rolling on the floor, then we can measure that and come back, in a few weeks, or, oftentimes session to session, week to week, has this change. Oh yeah, they've gone from 45 minutes to now 30 minutes, or he's only doing it 2 times a week instead of 3 times a week. So that's a very important piece of tracking as well, that has to be done with people. Asking them between, when they come in for a session, any changes. There are possibilities of people having negative reactions. Luckily, it's not common or typical, but for example, if we take the HEG headband, we start out at 3 minutes, because if you go for further than that, it can create headaches. It's an agitation. It can actually strain a person's brain doing that. So the limitations, and if somebody's training the wrong sites or the wrong frequencies, people can have issues. And that's why it's important to do brain map, get the proper training. There's certification that you can get and so on. Because right now in the state of Virginia, there's no regulating board. So, theoretically, someone could start a neurofeedback practice and you don't know. It's questionable what their training is. So that's another important factor, finding out some more about what's their training, what's their experience, who they're mentoring with, are they BCIA certified, that kind of thing. So this, coming back to Lubar, I think we looked at that, his studies. I tried to add a little bit about different diagnoses. So this is just describing how people with alcoholism or alcoholics, when they take brain maps, they tend to see some patterns with them, and their patterns are dysregulated. Some of the things that they have trouble with, synchronization of their brain activity. That's the research that it came out of from. Peniston and Kowalski, if you study neurofeedback or learn more about it, you'll hear a lot about Peniston. He was one that did a study in the 80s and 90s with PTSD vets who were also alcoholic. And he got very good results. He used neurofeedback. He also included other things you'll see in the second paragraph, systematic desensitization, temperature biofeedback, guided imagery. So he was using the rhythmic deep breathing. He was using a few different modalities in his training that he had. One of the, this protocol has become fairly popular. It's called the Alpha Theta protocol. And it's used with, it can be actually used with anybody. Part of our training is we got to do an Alpha Theta protocol. And so my experience of doing that was probably the first time I've ever truly understood what somebody said when they say go on a mental vacation. And so hence that picture. I was swimming in the ocean. Had memories of swimming near a sea turtle, times in the past that were very therapeutic to me. I had never experienced that before, but in doing the Alpha Theta protocol, that's kind of what came up. And so it's crossing over of the two bands, the alpha and the theta, that give people or can give people that kind of experience. It's also called the open focus protocol. Some people use the expression window wiping effect, where all of a sudden things become much clearer to them. So oftentimes there's creativity or moments of clarity that come out for people after they do this. And so it can be very effective. A lot of the people I train have this protocol as part of their sessions. Not everybody, but a lot of people do. So there's kind of an image of meditation and alpha, brain map during resting state, and brain map when people were able to increase their alpha brain waves. And that's transcendental meditation. So what's most curious is the statistical significance that they had after they did this study. Many of them were on pharmaceuticals that may or may not have had much of a benefit. So kind of tried to highlight the significant areas. When they did the follow-up studies, they had a control group and they had a group that did this kind of intervention. Only 3 of the 20 experimental patients had relapsed. So any of you that work with chemical dependence knows how significant that is. And that's after about 2 years follow-up. The bottom is a follow-up study a group in private practice was trying to replicate the Peniston study. And their results, again, were small, but they showed, participants showed significant improvements on the back depression inventory, and only one subject had relapsed. ACOAs, another group, family members that live with chemical dependency. They often struggle with symptoms of anxiety and have fast type brainwave activity that can benefit from being trained down. There's a picture of Seaburn Fisher's book, Neurofeedback and the Development or Treatment of Developmental Trauma. And she works with the circuitry of the brain typically associated with the hippocampus and amygdala. The wonderful thing about Seaburn is she's very brave and daring, and so because of her courage, she has been able to work with clients of trauma and say, well, let's try this and see what happens. And that's how a lot of, she's gotten a lot of her information and her results. More recently, she started doing a FP2 training, which integrates the front of the brain to the back of the brain, and some of that was based on something called a default mode network. I mentioned earlier there's 4 or 5 networks in the brain, and so the default mode network is what is our brain doing when we're not engaged in anything? What is our brain doing at resting? And so there are differences in people's default mode networks that have experienced some trauma, and so she was doing some protocols with that. So that's just a description of some of the trauma symptoms that you might see working with a trauma person that you're probably pretty familiar with. She also is a big proponent for psychotherapy, and not that this wouldn't be used as a standalone treatment, but an adjunct. And the idea that more is always better does not apply. Most trainings or protocols are done for about 11 minutes. There are some protocols like the alpha theta training that's 25 minutes. But you could do 2 or 3 protocols potentially within 30 minutes or 40 minutes. And what she found also is that people tend to start talking a lot more because a lot of these fear-based traumas are in parts of the brain that don't have language. And so as the people started to develop or strengthen some of the language to put words to their trauma, they actually spoke more and processed some things in traditional counseling that they weren't able to do before. Swingle is another research neurophysiologist. He's up in Canada, and he's done research. He mostly started with sleep research, and he found that in doing sleep studies, there are a number of people that have inadequate REM, rapid eye movement, and that oftentimes clients that hadn't dealt with their emotional trauma had this kind of symptom. And so he focuses on O1, which is here in the back of the brain, doing some training with that. And it's, interestingly enough, if you are using the technology, or if I'm doing an initial brain map, oftentimes at O1 you'll see the kind of activity or that he talks about, or you'll see a lot of muscle tension in that area. This talks about alpha response and how alpha is one of the brain waves in our, and how we experience that. There's something called alpha blocking, where when we close our eyes, most of us, our brains produce more alpha, and so we're in a more slow, relaxed state. Typically, when we open our eyes, most people become more focused and alert. But some people's brains have difficulty shifting and doing that, so when they open their eyes, their alpha doesn't drop, and so that creates problems for them. This, somebody had, his research, part of it was exposing just images, when people had disturbing images exposed to them and how that affected their brain. And so another hypothesis is that trauma is affecting people's brains in that way as well. This alcohol, I think it kind of jumped, that talks a little bit about patterns you may see if you're looking at somebody that struggles. So people that are experts in QEEG or looking at brain maps or looking at brain waves, they can actually, and I think Swingle does this, he doesn't want to know anything about the person, he doesn't want to take any symptoms, he just does a brain map, and then he kind of comes in similar to like a fortune teller and says, this is what's going on, you know, my best guess. So he likes kind of using that approach to, I guess, wow people or get their attention. So there's increased frontal alpha when people use marijuana, and so that's oftentimes what you'll see in substance abusers, or if I work with people that use marijuana, oftentimes they don't want to give it up, and part of the reason is because it's creating more alpha in their brain, which can get a relaxed effect if they're dealing with anxiety. And so, you know, having an alternative, you're able to create more alpha in your brain if you can train your brain to do that. It's difficult for people that have been smoking marijuana to make a change with that. And then the other issue oftentimes is the ADHD. They're smoking marijuana to get relaxed or help them focus, and it could be kind of working against it. Some of the changes they'll see in brain mappings when they look at SSRIs is changes in the slow activity, a mild frontal and central beta increase. And so the medications are working in the similar things to activate the brain. Many times in the left frontal part, the person's brain needs to have some changes. So this is a slide I recently added because I was trying to research the effects of antidepressants. One of my mentors had talked about people improve with antidepressant medication, but how much are they improving in terms of what percentage, and how is that different from neurofeedback, if, for example. And so one of the studies showed was that obviously antidepressants are very effective for a lot of people, but it seemed to have more of an impact with the people that had a severe or long-standing depression versus a more situational or shorter or less intense one. And so one of the studies showed the people that took an antidepressant had a 50 to 65% success rate, and the people that were just given a placebo, 25 to 30. So there's still some area in there where people are experiencing benefit from just taking a pill. One of the arguments regarding neurofeedback is there's not enough double-blind studies, and so neurofeedback has been challenged to kind of prove itself. And other modalities, for example, acupuncture or chiropractic work, they don't have double-blind studies either. It's hard to have a control group that's sitting there with no needles and then a control, or vice versa, subject group that has needles. So people are working harder to get more double-blind studies and to create efficacy. So here just talks more about the study of antidepressants and placebos. 41% of people that were switched to placebos relapsed compared to 18% who remained on antidepressants. So I guess that's about half. So some of the medications are having a small effect in patients that are more broadly classified as being depressed. This is a picture of Adderall, and it shows a brain with Adderall is fairly activated, but it's activated in all areas, not just, the prefrontal cortex or the midline part of the brain. So most people with ADHD, typical patterns are prefrontal cortex or the midline. They're finding out more. So if they can work to treat those those specific areas of the brain rather than the whole brain, people may have improved appetites and other less agitation, things like that they might struggle with. So I think I mentioned before, neurofeedback is a little bit different from other modalities. It's feedback. It's not, there's no external stimulation. So with TMS, you've got a magnet that's being placed over that brain area to create kind of electrical activity. ECT, you're getting electricity in your brain. But this is just regulating your own brain waves. So that could be a positive thing or a negative thing. Individuals that are kind of self-efficacy, they want to see changes, they may benefit a little bit more. Some clients that it's hard to get them to focus or motivate, it might be more difficult. Some of the neurofeedback with kids will utilize other reinforcements. So if they're able to be successful in one of their protocols, they might get chips or tokens to turn in for rewards. So sometimes, we have to offer other rewards to them in addition to just participating in the neurofeedback. So with the CAP, I handed out before, there's a typical sequence that we'll do. Well, even before that, typically it's the initial assessment, the biopsychosocial, what have they struggled with, what their families like, what are their stressors, what medications have they taken, what are interventions have they tried, those kind of things. Oftentimes people that have participated in neurofeedback have tried a lot of other things, or they just don't really want to take medications. So maybe they've tried deep breathing, they've tried exercising, they've tried eating healthy, a lot of different things. So we'll do a recording, eyes open, eyes closed, and then task. And that's brief. It's usually only for about a minute that they're getting recordings of each of those. One of the things, if you work with brain mapping is you have to learn, or if it's in your program, how to artifact. And so things like eye blink, muscle tension, that can impact the brain map that you're getting. And so you have to work with people to minimize eye blink, tense and release out some of the muscle tension they may have to get a good recording. But there's also artifact programs within the systems that help you artifact out things that may be things other than the brainwave. So there's just a map for you of the international sites, and they're labeled based on the part of the brain: frontal, temporal, central, parietal, and occipital. There's a picture of somebody doing neurofeedback in my office, or getting ready to. I'm going to try to speed it up because we're low on time, but different types of neurofeedback. So traditional neurofeedback is what I talked about today. There's something called S-Loretta neurofeedback, which they focus on a region of interest. And so they'll focus in on subcortical parts of the brain, or use different technology for that. There's something called lens neurofeedback, which is actually putting a radio signal into the brain. And from what they've found is this oftentimes is quicker, and maybe less number of sessions needed for a person to use that. I was curious about TMS results because I've had clients that have benefited from it, and others that had gone through a series and not so much. So I think in the middle it talked about the response rate was about 41%. So it's effective compared to the sham group, which was only 10%, but it's still, not reaching as much probably as we'd like it to reach. So I wanted to just talk really briefly about one case study of a client who's 20-year-old Caucasian female, and she is the middle child of her parents. Her mother's a physician and her father's a firefighter. Family history of depression and alcoholism with her father, depression with her older brother. And I started working with her, just doing traditional talk therapy in summertime. And she was advised to start on medication, which she did. She actually had a gene site test, which is a genetic test, a swab, which tells people which antidepressants are going to be most effective for them based on their genes. And in doing that, they found that she was deficient. I believe it was an amino acid, or there was something that she needed to add to help her brain absorb any antidepressant that she was taking. And so we did traditional talk therapy. She went back to college, which was in the state of Virginia, but it was several hours away, and things weren't getting any better for her. In fact, they were getting worse. And so the nurse practitioner recommended her taking a break. And I said, well, maybe let's try this neurofeedback, see if it can help at all. So that's January, and it's some of her symptoms that she's rated, highlighted in the yellow. And you can hopefully see the scores on the left that she put on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being the worst. What are you experiencing? So she's got a 10 for sleep disturbance, a 9 for hard to wake, An 8 up top, I can't quiet my mind. Attention, 10, I drift off into thoughts. 9, easily distracted. A 10 for anxiety. So she had a combination of attentional issues, anxiety, and depression. And her memory was affected, as you see at the bottom right.
I'm sorry, did you say there was a history of trauma or no?
No, none other than growing up with an alcoholic father, which would be, would be traumatizing. Yeah. So, but no, overt physical or sexual abuse reported. So there's about a month later. So, for example, her sleep went from a 10 down to an 8. It's flip back. Her attention, the one that was at a 10, I drift off, went down to a 6. I'm easily distracted from tasks, went from a 9 to a 6. So we're trending down in the positive direction that we would hope. Anxiety at the top dropped from a 10 to a 7. And sometimes you'll see, some symptoms will decrease the way we want them to, and other time, other symptoms may stay the same or increase. But that's how typically we want to track it. I've gotten to the point where I track more regularly. It's after about every 4 sessions to try to get a better measure and make sure we're on track. So this is in March. Continues to decrease, still having some issues with attention, some issues with sleep disturbance, which is was a 10, now is a 6. So this is April, bless you. Sleep disturbance has gone from 10 to a 5. Anxiety was a 10 on the top, now it's a 3. Attention improved a little more. But typically, we'll try to track 5 to 8 symptoms. The more symptoms that we try to track, the more complicated it can get. So what we'll try to do is have them rank which ones are most disturbing to them or which ones they would like to see a change in the most. So she ended up getting good benefits. She ended up doing a course of 40 sessions of neurofeedback. She was working full time. She's able to meet her goals of going to the gym 2 to 3 times a week. Her relationships have improved tremendously. Somebody that she felt very fearful of or felt that was being very negative towards her, they now oftentimes go to the gym as a gym partner. So a lot of great effects. One of the struggles she has is, am I going to return to college, and if so, what am I going to major in? I had her do the self-directed search, which helped her kind of narrow down what might be a good fit for her, but she's still, that's still a struggle for her. She hasn't found the answer, or, so in that sense, it's helpful, but it's not going to necessarily help everything or every issue that a person's, might be grappling with. So that was an example of a good case study. Most of them are positive. Nobody's, I think I've had a couple people drop out of treatment before they were able to finish a course of 20 or more. But for the most part, we get, some benefits from this. So why people don't do this more? Well, there's a tremendous amount of energy that goes into it. Time, energy, cost. There's a lot of training. I call it my second graduate degree because it really is. And just kind of an outline. If you're BCIA certified, you'll start with 4 to 5 days or 38 hours of training. You have to get the clinical practice hours in. You have to work with a mentor. pay for that, similar to becoming licensed. And it's costly. The equipment is anywhere from $6,000 to $10,000 and up. So nobody's reimbursing you for your equipment. No, insurance companies aren't reimbursing you. So it's kind of something that you have to be passionate about and really love. The lens equipment, I believe that's around $10,000 just for that type of neurofeedback. So that's probably, you know, why more people aren't doing it. And it's not as quick or as easy as pulling out a prescription pad and writing something down either. So.
Do you know whether the VA hospital uses neurofeedback? That's
My trainer, one of my trainers or mentors in Northern Virginia, Donna Creasy, she approached the VA in Richmond, Virginia, and they weren't interested, but I do believe they're utilizing it in Northern Virginia now. So, yeah. Yeah. So it probably depends on the actual hospital. Yeah.
Is there any, that one place they might have it, but I don't know, and I'll have to look into it. Is there any time that you would use this with chronic pain?
Yeah, there's a whole division. And today I spoke to kind of mental health issues, but neurofeedback can be for many people. So actually initially it started out with the person with a seizure disorder. People use it for migraines, and so it's used in brain injury clinics. So the applications are very wide and broad. So there's a whole group of people that utilize it for chronic pain and do research and presentation, that kind of thing on that. Yeah, it's kind of neat too, because with the fMRI, that's kind of new technology. They can see the blood flow and the changes in the brain, and so it's helping support neurofeedback. They're actually researchers using fMRI neurofeedback for research, and have had a lot of positive results. I think they estimated that right now, if somebody was to pay for one session of fMRI neurofeedback, it would be $1,000 per session. So it's not, that's not here yet, but yeah.
In the long term, it's cheaper than medicine for your whole life, and the side effects. And
Yeah. There was actually one study they did in a conference on chronic pain, and they found that the insula part of the brain wasn't working effectively for the people that had chronic pain, and the treatment was acupuncture, like 20 sessions of acupuncture, and then they came back and looked at the brain and saw positive benefits. So that was kind of encouraging to, you know, see that had efficacy.
had severe migraines on a regular basis, had this, and said her migraines are down to a few a year from many a month or week.
Yeah, because the brain and the body's connected, a lot of the things that we struggle with will be, you know, connected to our brain, and, you know, if we make changes in that, it may correct other things.
How long is each session? How long do the people sit there and do the training?
Typically, it could range between 30 minutes and an hour. I utilize the HEG headband in addition to the electrodes, and so that kind of accounts for a certain time. But with the protocols generally being 10 minutes, some more, typically people will do 2 or 3 protocols when they come in, the electrodes and then HEG. Lens, I believe if you're using lens, it's 5 to 10 minutes, and yeah, about the same.
And then how many sessions? Do you have a certain minimum number or a certain?
Typically, I recommend people to do about 20, but then in terms of their condition, so for example, severe depression, they may need 30 to 40. People who have autism and Asperger's have done up to like a year to, shape their brain circuitry. So some of it depends on the diagnosis.
I actually discontinued this after about 7 sessions for my ADD because it was completely passive, just watching a movie and it would go out of focus or do weird things, but I could never get an adequate, for me it was an adequate explanation of what was happening. And it just got frustrating.
Yeah, and that can happen. I mean, I've had clients get frustrated. Did you have a brain map done before you started? Yeah. So that can be really essential because what they're finding is there's different patterns. So if your, pattern was in the central part of your brain more than the prefrontal part of your brain, and that can impact it. Also, with the alpha, our alpha in our brain tends to decrease as we age. So people, we start to have memory issues. And so, unless you're really getting a map of the brain, no one's 100% sure what's going on in your particular brain. So, I have clients that come in, they say, I have ADHD, and the more I talk to them or do a brain map, it's like depression. And they can't focus and concentrate because they're preoccupied. So,
what's a typical first session? Would you do the whole brain map in the first session and lay out all this is what we're going to do and that's what we're going to do? Is it like an hour or is it more or less?
Yeah, after their biopsychosocial, then we'll schedule a brain map, and that's usually an hour to an hour and a half. And then the other pieces are, symptoms and getting their medication list, giving them an idea of what to expect. Yeah.
3, possibly 4 sessions before you get into it,
Probably about 3, yeah. Typically, I'll go over, I have the ability to give them a documentation in Word form that they can take home, but usually I'll go over that with clients in a session. If somebody's more of a professional, like I have a RN who's going to be doing it, she says, I'm fine, I'll go home and read this, but typically I'll review it with the person. So I thank you for coming, and if you have any questions, let me see if I've got. That's my email at the bottom. And recommended reading, if you want just kind of a general overview, I recommend that book. It's designed for the layperson, makes it easy and understandable.